The dark truth of why Gimli didn't know Moria had fallen. There is a moment in the story that almost everyone misreads. A dwarf stands before ancient gates, buried under a mountain's cold face. He speaks of his father's letters. He speaks of a cousin who is lord of a great realm, of halls lit with silver and gold, of a people returned at last to the home they lost 1,000 years ago. He is not bracing himself. He is not steeling himself against grief. He is, by every surface reading, excited, hopeful. A son on his way to see family. But the letters stopped coming 25 years ago. And here is the thing that the films never told you, that the scene is constructed to make you feel, but never say out loud. On some level, Gimli already knew. Not consciously, maybe, not in the way you know facts, but in the way you know things when the silence has gone on long enough that the silence itself has become the answer, and you have simply chosen not to call it by its name. This is not a reading pulled from thin air. This is what the text actually says when you follow it all the way down, through the appendices, through the council records of Rivendell, through the way Tolkien wrote dwarf psychology across 40 years of world building, through one small line spoken over a tomb that most people hear and immediately move past. When you lay it all flat and look at it together, what you find is not a story about an information gap. What you find is a story about a people so defined by ancestral longing that they chose the dream over the evidence, and they sent one of their most beloved sons walking ahead of them into the proof. So the question is this: when Gimli voted to enter Moria, did he truly believe Balin's colony might still live? Or had he already, in the privacy of 25 years of silence, made peace with being the one who would finally go in and see? We are going to find out, and it is going to change how you hear every line he speaks in that mountain. Let us begin with what the text actually establishes, because the timeline is the first thing that needs to land properly, and once it does, you will not be able to unhear it. Balin, son of Fundin, led an expedition into Moria in the year 2989 of the Third Age. This is confirmed in Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings, in the section titled Durin's Folk, which is one of the most information-dense and underread passages in the entire legendarium. Balin was not some marginal figure mounting a reckless adventure. He was a lord of his people. He had stood in the lonely mountain with Thorin Oakenshield. He had seen the dragon slain and the treasure reclaimed. He was, by any measure of dwarf culture and dwarf politics, a figure of immense weight and legitimacy. When Balin decided Moria was worth attempting, that was not a fringe opinion. That was a statement about where Durin's folk believed their future lay. And in the early years, it seemed to be working. Appendix A records that letters came from Balin, that Glóin, Gimli's father, received word of initial success. The colony established a foothold. They found the upper halls. They reclaimed what could be reclaimed. And for a time, those letters traveled the long road out of the mountain and into the wider world of dwarves who were watching and hoping. Then the letters stopped. The exact year is not recorded with precision, but by 2994, the colony was gone. Every member of Balin's expedition, every dwarf who had followed a dream into the deep places of the earth, was dead. Some died at the East Gate. Some died in Dimril Dale trying to flee. Balin himself died by an arrow from an orc at Miromir, the sacred lake above the eastern entrance, the lake where the first Durin had once seen his own reflection crowned with stars. The Book of Mazarbul, which the Fellowship would later find in the chamber of Mazarbul, where Balin's tomb stood, records the end in fragmentary and increasingly desperate entries. They were cut off, the water rose. They could not get out. And then nothing. For 25 years, nothing. The Fellowship walks into Moria in 3019, that is 25 years of silence. Not 5, not 10. 25 years during which not one survivor emerged, not one message escaped, not one piece of information reached Erebor or the Iron Hills to tell Glóin and Gimli and the rest of Durin's folk what had happened to the 400 or so dwarves who had followed Balin into the dark. Pay attention to what 25 years actually means. In human terms, that is a generation. That is long enough for children to be born, grow up, and come of age without ever knowing a time when Moria was not simply gone. In dwarf terms, given their longer lifespans, it may feel shorter in one sense, but that only makes the silence more thunderous. Dwarves are not a people who lose track of their kin. They are not a people who forget the names of their dead. They are, as Tolkien writes in Letter 144, a tough, thrawn race, stubborn and long-memoried, lovers of things that endure. A silence of 25 years would not slip past them. It would press on them, daily, like stone. And here is where it gets strange. Nothing was sent in response. Doin the Second Ironfoot, who ruled Erebor at the time, was not a man, a hobbit, or an elf who might have lacked the martial capacity to mount an investigation. He was the Lord who had won the Battle of 5 Armies. He was the ruler who would die fighting at the gates of Dale in 3019, aged 252 years old, still in armor, still killing Easterlings. Dane was a warrior king of the old school. And yet, in the face of 25 years of silence from a colony of hundreds of his people, led by one of his most distinguished lords, he mounted no expedition, sent no scouts, attempted no contact. The official answer, the answer that the text offers by default, is that Moria was simply too dangerous, that everyone knew the Balrog, Durin's Bane, was in there, that the eastern gate was watched by orcs, that the mountain had become impenetrable. And this is true. All of that is true. But true does not mean complete. Because here is what nobody asks. Did they know, or did they believe? There is a difference between knowing that a rescue was impossible and choosing to believe that a rescue was impossible, because knowing the rescue was impossible was the only way to live with the silence. The human mind, and apparently the dwarf mind as Tolkien constructed it, has a remarkable capacity for finding reasons not to do the thing that would require it to confirm the worst. You do not go in because the orcs are there. You do not go in because Durin's Bane is there. You do not go in because the mountain is dark and sealed and ancient. These are all true, and they are all, conveniently, also reasons you do not have to find out what happened to your people. Picture this. Erebor, sometime in the years after the letters stopped. A hall of stone, deep under the lonely mountain, lit by forge fire and the glow of worked gems. Gloin, son of Groin, sits across a table from other lords, and the conversation has circled back, as it always does, to Moria. Not with urgency, not with immediate grief. The urgency has faded because urgency requires action, and action requires either the courage to go or the courage to admit you will not. So instead, the conversation settles into the language of reason, the patrols at the gate, the strength of the orcs in the misty mountains, the fact that Durin's Bane has not been seen or confirmed destroyed, and you do not send soldiers against a Balrog. All of this is said in measured voices. And somewhere in the room, or somewhere down the hall, a young dwarf who has grown up hearing about Balin, about Moria, about the greatest homeland of Durin's folk, is listening, not to the words, to what the words are built around, the silence at the center of the conversation that no one will name. The shape of the grief that is not called grief, because calling it grief would mean admitting that it is permanent. That young dwarf is Gimli. And this is the thing that I think matters more than any timeline or appendix entry. Gimli grew up inside that silence. He did not encounter the loss of Moria's colony as a fact, delivered to him one day, and then resolved. He grew up in it. He breathed it. He watched his father and the other lords of Erebor build, across years and years of unanswered quiet, a posture of not knowing that slowly became something very close to a religion. We do not know. We cannot get in. Balin is perhaps still there. Perhaps the news will come. It never came. But you can, if you try hard enough, convince yourself that the absence of news is not itself news. You can, If you are a people defined by ancestral longing and the particular dwarf capacity for what Tolkien elsewhere describes as a kind of proud grief, a grief that turns inward and hardens, you can convince yourself that the silence is still open, that it has not yet resolved, that somewhere inside that mountain, behind the orcs and the dark water and the thing that killed the world once before, Balin might still be there. This is not stupidity. This is not even dishonesty, exactly. This is what hope looks like in a people who have already lost everything once and cannot afford to lose it again. Now hold that picture in your mind, because we need to go somewhere else in the Legendarium before we come back to it. The Silmarillion records the original fall of Khazad-dûm in the year 1981 of the Third Age, and it does so with very little ceremony. A shadow fell, it says. Durin's bane awoke, the dwarves fled, and then, for over 1,000 years, Moria was simply empty. Or not empty, since the Balrog was in it, and eventually the orcs moved in under it, but empty of dwarves. Empty of the people for whom it had been made, to whom it was, in a sense that goes beyond mere property, a part of their identity so fundamental that losing it was not quite like losing a home. It was like losing the ground the home stood on. The dwarves spent those 1,000 years in exile. They moved through Eriador. They settled briefly in Dunland. They made their way eventually to the Grey Mountains, and then, after the Cold Drakes came, further still. They are, across the Third Age, a people in perpetual displacement, carrying the memory of what they had and what they lost in a way that the text suggests is close to the way they carry everything, silently, internally, with a kind of compressed intensity that never quite dissipates. And then, 1,000 years into that exile, Thorin's company reclaimed Erebor. Think about what that moment meant. The Lonely Mountain, the second greatest realm of Durin's folk after Khazad-dûm itself, taken back from a dragon. Smaug was dead. The treasure was restored. Doin was king, and the kingdom was wealthy and protected. By every external measure, Durin's folk had won something extraordinary. But Moria was still there, still dark, still sealed. Still the first and greatest home, the place where Durin himself had looked into the lake and seen the stars crown his reflection. The place where the Mithril ran, the place that dwarfed every other dwarf realm by any measure you chose. And Balin, who had been part of the quest that reclaimed Erebor, looked at what they had won and decided it was not enough. That the greatest prize was still unclaimed, that Moria was still waiting. Here is what that tells us about the psychology of Durin's folk that shapes everything else in this story. Even victory was not quite victory. Even restoration was not quite restoration. The wound of Moria, first inflicted in 1981 when Durin's bane awoke, was still open 1,000 years later, and the reclamation of Erebor did not close it. It may have actually sharpened it, because now they had the strength and the stability to ask, what about Moria? And Balin had the prestige and the will to try. The expedition of 2989 was not, in this reading, simply an act of ambition. It was an act of grief, an attempt to finally close a wound that had defined Durin's folk for over 1,000 years. And when it failed, when the silence descended and the letters stopped, the wound did not close. It just went underground again, internal again, compressed again, the way dwarf grief always does. By the time Gimli is born, Moria is not a place in his experience. It is a mythology. It is the great lost thing that his people circle the way you circle a fire, close enough to feel the heat, never close enough to touch. And this matters to understanding what he is doing at the Council of Elrond, and what he votes for when the path through Moria is proposed. Glóin and Gimli come to Rivendell because Sauron has sent a messenger to Erebor. Appendix A confirms this. The messenger asked after Bilbo and after a certain golden ring, and the presence of that messenger, the weight of what it implied, drove Glóin to seek counsel from Elrond. That is the official reason for the journey. That is the mission. But there is something embedded in the text that most readers pass over. Gloin and Gimli were also, explicitly, seeking news of Balin's expedition. Appendix A makes this clear. The letters had stopped. They did not know why. They had come to Rivendell partly because Elrond, whose connections and intelligence networks reached into places dwarves could not, might have heard something. This was not a secondary concern. It was woven into the purpose of the journey, which means that by the time they arrived at Rivendell, the question of what had happened in Moria was already alive and pressing for them, not as background noise, but as an actual open wound they were actively trying to close. Now think about what they found at the Council of Elrond. No news, no word from survivors, no travelers who had passed the East Gate and seen anything. Just the same silence, now confirmed by the most informed ears in Middle-earth. That silence is its own kind of answer. Elrond knows things. Elrond has been in Middle-earth since the First Age. His household is a clearinghouse for information from every people who still cares about the fate of the world. And Elrond has nothing to say about Balin's colony. No reassuring word. No partial news. Nothing. If you had any remaining ability to pretend the silence was still open, that meeting should have ended it. And this is where the speculation becomes not speculation, but something very close to necessity. Because Gimli votes to enter Moria. He does not just accept the decision passively. He advocates for it. When the debate at the Council of Elrond turns to the path the Fellowship should take, Gimli argues for the mountain. He argues for Moria. He does this knowing that his own father has been unable to reach Balin for years, knowing that Elrond himself has no news of the colony, knowing that every silence they have heard has been answered by deeper silence. He argues for it anyway. The charitable reading, the reading the films encourage you to make, is that he still believed. That hope was genuine, and the ignorance was complete, and what happened when they found the chamber of Mazarbul was pure, unprocessed shock. But then you read the line. In the chamber of Mazarbul, standing over the tomb of Balin, son of Fundin, lord of Moria, Gimli says this: "He is dead then. It is as I feared. It is as I feared. Not, I cannot believe it. Not, this cannot be. Not, how did this happen? It is as I feared." Past tense. Already formed. Already lived with, probably for years. The fear was not new. The fear was old. The fear was the companion of all the silence, of all the years of no letters, of the meeting at Rivendell, where even Elrond had nothing to offer. The fear had been there. Gimli had been carrying it. And he walked in anyway. This is the moment the entire script has been building toward, and it deserves to be slowed down and seen for what it is. Because there are two ways to read what Gimli did, and they point to completely different understandings of his character, of his people, and of what Tolkien was actually doing with this storyline. The first reading is the straightforward one. Gimli was hopeful, feared the worst, and went in hoping to be wrong. This is the heroic ignorance reading. He did not know, he feared, he hoped, he lost. The second reading is the one that the lore, when you follow it through the full context of dwarf psychology and the 25-year silence, makes more persuasive. Gimli knew, not factually. Not in the way you know that the sun rises in the east, but in the way that a man who has watched his house from a distance for 25 years and seen no smoke from the chimney and heard no sound through the walls, knows, even as he reaches for the door handle. He knew in his bones. He feared in the way you fear things that you have already, in the privacy of your own grief, already half accepted. And he walked in anyway, not despite knowing, but because knowing required a witness. Picture this. Gimli, son of Gloin, at the gates of Moria. It is night. The Watcher is in the water behind them, and the gates have just opened, and the Fellowship is about to step into the dark. And Gimli pauses, just for a moment, not with theatrical grief. He is a dwarf, and dwarves do not perform their grief for others. But there is a moment, Just before he steps across the threshold, when the weight of what he suspects, what he has perhaps known for years, is fully present. He is not going in to find his cousin. He is going in to find his cousin's tomb. He knows this, the way you know things you have not said aloud, because saying them aloud makes them permanent, and you are not ready for them to be permanent, not until you have seen the proof with your own eyes, and held it in your hands, and stood over it, and said the words that name it for what it is. It is as I feared. The line is not shock. The line is confirmation. And the difference between shock and confirmation is the difference between ignorance and courage. Because here is what that reframe does to Gimli as a character. It does not diminish him. It elevates him. The heroic ignorance reading makes Gimli a tragic figure who was simply uninformed. The knowing witness reading makes him something much more profound. It makes him a man who went into a place he had good reason to believe was already a mass grave, not because he was deceived, not because he was naive, but because his people needed someone to go in and see. Someone to stand over the tomb and say the words that had not been said in 25 years. Someone to witness. And this is where the lore of Tolkien's dwarves, read across the full legendarium, becomes essential. Because the dwarves do not have a culture of public mourning the way men do, or a tradition of elvish lament that turns grief into song and sends it skyward. Dwarf grief is internal. It calcifies. It becomes part of the stone of who they are, and they carry it without display, and often without resolution. The wound of Khazad-dûm in 1981 was never properly resolved. The exile was never properly mourned. They simply moved, and kept moving, and kept the wound inside and called it memory. What Balin's expedition did, in its failure, was reopen that wound in a way that nothing in 1,000 years had been able to do. And then the silence fell again, and the wound went back inside again, and the dwarves of Erebor did what dwarves do with things that cannot be fixed. They stopped talking about it. They kept moving. They kept the dream alive in the form that costs least, the form of not yet knowing. But not yet knowing has a shelf life, and at some point in those 25 years, it curdled. Here is where the second lore layer becomes critical, because Gimli's ignorance, such as it was not only sustained by his own people's refusal to investigate. It was also, in a way that Tolkien does not foreground but does not hide, sustained by Gandalf. Unfinished tales, and the wider account of the Council of Elrond in the Fellowship of the Ring both confirm something significant. Gandalf had attempted to enter Moria from the East Gate before the events of the quest. He tried and was driven back. He describes, at the Council of Elrond, feeling a power that he could not name, something in the dark of the mountain that made it clear he could not pass that way. He does not specify exactly what he felt, or exactly when this attempt was made, but the clear implication is that Gandalf had engaged with the question of Moria before the Fellowship was ever formed. He had, at minimum, established by direct experience, that the mountain was sealed by something more than orcs. Now here is the thing nobody asks about that. Gandalf knew, or had strong reason to suspect, that something had gone catastrophically wrong in Moria. He had felt the power at the Eastern Gate. He had been at the Council of Elrond when the question of Balin's colony was surfaced. He had access to every piece of available intelligence, and his intelligence was not small. He understood the rings of power, the nature of Sauron's strategy, the movements of orcs across the misty mountains. This was not a man who had failed to think about Moria. And when Moria was proposed as a path for the Fellowship, when Gimli argued for it with the hope or the grief or whatever it was that drove him, Gandalf did not say, "I went there. I felt something in the dark I could not name. The colony may already be gone," he said. "I will not go into Moria." That was his position. Not, "Here is what I found when I tried." Not, "Let me tell you what Gimli needs to understand before he casts his vote." Just the refusal, stated firmly, with the weight of a man who has reasons he is not fully sharing. Why? The answer the text offers is that Gandalf feared the Balrog. He had, at some level, suspected or known what was sleeping under the mountain, and he did not want to wake it. And this is probably true, but it does not fully account for his silence about what he had experienced at the gate, or about the reasonable conclusion that anyone with his information should have been able to draw about the colony's fate. Gandalf protected Gimli's ignorance. Not maliciously. Not even consciously, perhaps, but the effect is the same. In not disclosing the full weight of what he knew or suspected, Gandalf allowed Gimli to enter Moria carrying a hope, or a grief dressed as hope, that was not challenged by the one member of the company who could have challenged it with evidence. And you have to ask yourself whether Gandalf made that choice deliberately. Because Gandalf is not a character who withholds information carelessly. He is a character who withholds information strategically, and his strategy is almost always built around the principle that people must be allowed to find their own way to their own choices, that the Maiar cannot and should not remove from men and dwarves and hobbits the freedom to face what they must face in their own time and their own way. This is a core principle of how Tolkien constructs the Istari. They are not permitted to compel. They are not permitted to replace the free will of the peoples of Middle-earth with the certainty of divine foreknowledge. But there is a difference between respecting free will and allowing a dwarf to walk into a tomb without the information he would need to truly choose. Unless you believe, as Gandalf may have believed, that Gimli had already made his choice, that the choice was made not at the Council of Elrond, but across 25 years of silence. That Gimli's vote to enter Moria was not an act of hope in the ordinary sense, but an act of will, the will to go and see, to be the witness, to finally say the words over the grave that his people had been unable to say for a generation. And Gandalf, who understood grief and will and the necessity of facing what cannot be undone, may have recognized that and stepped aside. Picture this. Two figures in the halls of Rivendell. Not in any meeting the text records, but in the space between meetings, in the corridors of the last homely house. Gandalf moving through the lamplight, and Gimli somewhere nearby, and both of them carrying the same knowledge that neither will fully speak. Gandalf knows the mountain is dark. Gimli knows the letters stopped. Neither one says it plainly, because saying it plainly means facing it plainly, and neither one, for different reasons, is ready to do that yet. But both of them vote to take the mountain road. There is something in that shared not speaking that is almost a kind of covenant, an agreement to go in, to face it, to witness what must be witnessed, together. And then Gandalf falls in the dark below the bridge, and Gimli and the others escape into the light. And the witnessing continues without the one figure who might have carried some of its weight. We need to talk about what Tolkien actually encoded in the dwarf relationship to Moria, because it is more theologically layered than it appears on the surface. In the Silmarillion, in the section titled Of Aule and Yavanna, Tolkien tells the story of how the dwarves were made. Aule the smith, impatient and burning with the desire to create, shapes the 7 fathers of the dwarves in secret, before the children of Ilúvatar are awakened. Ilúvatar confronts him. Aule, in a moment of extraordinary humility, raises his hammer to unmake what he has made. And Ilúvatar, moved by that humility, gives the dwarves true life instead. But the shadow on their making is real. They were not intended. They were made in secret, by a Vala who could not fully impart what only Ilúvatar can give, the true inner life, the flame imperishable. And while Ilúvatar gives them that flame, the origin of their making leaves a mark. They are, as Yavanna says with some bitterness, stone children. They love what is under the earth and in the mountain, and shaped by craft and endurance. They do not love the living world in the way that elves do, or in the way that men do. And their grief is stone grief. It does not flow. It settles. Khazad-dûm Moria is not simply the greatest city of the dwarves. It is, in the deep logic of Tolkien's world-building, the truest expression of what dwarves are. Built under the mountain, hewn from living rock, lit by the glow of mithril and the craft of hands that knew stone the way a singer knows melody. To lose Moria was not, for Durin's folk, an ordinary loss. It was the loss of the place where they were most fully themselves. And mithril is not just a plot device or a measure of wealth. In Tolkien's world, mithril is specifically elvish in its association, the material that makes light armor the weight of feathers, the material that bridges the gap between the craft of stone and the craft of light. The mithril coat that Bilbo gives Frodo, which saves his life in the chamber of Mazarbul, was made in Moria. It was made in the place that is now a tomb, and it protects the ring-bearer when nothing else could. There is something in that specific detail that Tolkien constructed with care, whether consciously or through the deep instinct of a mythmaker. The greatest work of Moria, passed through Bilbo, who found it in Erebor, saved the quest that eventually destroyed the ring. The greatest product of the lost home of Durin's folk, the place the dwarves had spent 1,000 years trying to get back, was already out in the world, doing its work, long before anyone tried to reclaim the realm it came from. Moria was already contributing to the salvation of Middle-earth, through what it had made, through what it had given to the world before the darkness took it. This is the thing about Tolkien's world that takes your breath away when you find it. The losses are never complete. The darkness never takes everything. Something always escapes. Something always carries on. The mithril coat slips out of Moria on a dragon's back, and ends up around a hobbit's chest, and stops a troll's spear at the critical moment. And Gimli, who goes in to witness the death, comes out alive to carry the memory. The memory is the mithril coat of grief. It is what escapes. It is what protects. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before we can understand what Gimli carries out, we need to understand what he finds inside. The Chamber of Mazarbul is one of the most precisely rendered scenes in the Fellowship of the Ring, and most readers treat it as an action sequence with a side of tragic backstory. What it actually is a documentation of the complete failure of hope. The Book of Mazarbul, the fragmented record that Gandalf reads aloud in pieces while the Fellowship prepares to fight, is a masterpiece of compression. It begins with optimism. It documents initial success. It records the finding of Balin's tomb after Balin's death. It grows increasingly desperate. The final entries are barely legible. They are coming. That is the last thing anyone wrote. Gimli stands in that chamber and hears his cousin's chronicle of extinction read aloud by a wizard while orcs hammer at the door. And he says, very quietly, "He is dead then. It is as I feared." Not during the fighting. Not as an outcry. After Gandalf reads the record. After the full weight of what happened has been laid out, entry by entry, across the chamber. He says it quietly, privately, the way you say a thing you have been waiting to say for years, when the moment finally comes and the word can finally be spoken. This is a man confirming what he already knew. But the question that the script has been circling is now ready to be asked in its fuller form. We have established that the silence was 25 years old. We have established that Glóin and Gimli came to Rivendell actively seeking news of the colony. We have established that Gandalf had his own reasons for silence. We have established that Gimli's own words at the tomb suggest pre-existing fear rather than fresh shock. All of this points toward a Gimli who went into Moria carrying more knowledge than the films or even the casual reading of the text suggests. But here is the question that cuts deeper. Even if Gimli knew, even if the fear was already formed and the grief was already living inside him, even if he had looked at 25 years of silence and drawn the only conclusion 25 years of silence will support, what does it mean that he went anyway? What was he going for, if not for the rescue that was no longer possible? The answer, I think, is in the specific nature of dwarf grief, as Tolkien encoded it across the full legendarium. Dwarf grief does not resolve through mourning in the conventional sense. It does not release through tears or song or the passing of time. It hardens, it settles into the stone of who you are, and stays there, unmovable, unprocessed, doing slow damage in the dark. The dwarves who fled Moria in 1981 did not have a ceremony of mourning for what they left behind. They fled, and they survived, and they kept going. The wound went underground. It calcified. For 1,000 years, the loss of Khazad-dûm was an absence so fundamental that it was almost structural, part of the architecture of being a dwarf of Durin's line. What does it take to lance a wound that deep? I think it takes a witness. Someone who goes in and sees what happened and comes back and can say, I was there. I stood over the tomb. I read the record. I know the end of the story. Not from rumor, not from fear, from standing in the dark and hearing it read aloud while the enemy hammered at the door. Gimli was not going to rescue Balin. Gimli was going to bury him, not in the physical sense, since Balin's tomb was already made, already sealed, already standing in that chamber, but in the psychological sense, the cultural sense, the sense that matters most to a people who could not properly mourn what they had lost for 1,000 years, and then lost it again. He was going in to witness the death so that his people could finally stop waiting for news that was never going to come. And this reframes everything. It reframes his advocacy at the council. It reframes his silence when Gandalf refuses to explain why he will not go. It reframes the way he walks into that mountain, not with the lightness of expectation, but with the weight of a man who has already begun to carry something heavy, and is simply continuing to carry it. It reframes the line at the tomb. He is dead then. It is as I feared. These are not the words of a man who has just received terrible news. These are the words of a man who has just been released from 25 years of having to hold the question open. The fear is not new. The confirmation is new. And the confirmation is, in its own terrible way, a kind of relief. Now the grief can settle. Now it has a name and a place and a date. Now it is a fact that can be carried instead of a silence that has to be held. Picture this. The Fellowship emerging from Moria at the eastern gate, blinking in the light of Dimril Dale above the Mirrormere. And Gimli stops, for just a moment, and he looks back at the gate they have come out of, and he knows what is in there, knows it now with certainty and not with fear, knows the shape of the loss and the location of the tomb and the last words that were written before the end. He carries all of this. He will carry it for the rest of his life. But there is a difference now between the carrying and what came before. Before, the silence was a weight without edges, without definition, impossible to set down, because you did not know exactly what you were holding. Now he knows exactly what he is holding. He turns back toward the light. And this is where the lore takes the most devastating turn, because what Gimli does with what he has witnessed is not what you might expect. He does not break. He does not retreat into mourning. He does not stop. He continues the quest. He fights at Amon Hen. He pursues the Uruk-hai who took Merry and Pippin. He fights with Aragorn and Legolas across Rohan. He stands at Helm's Deep. He makes, in the process, the most unexpected friendship of the Third Age. A friendship with an elf that no dwarf or elf would have predicted or chosen or perhaps even believed possible. And this friendship, built in the shadow of Moria, across the miles and battles and strange graces that come after, becomes one of the quiet masterpieces of Tolkien's storytelling. The friendship between Gimli and Legolas is not a joke about their rivalry. It is not a comic relief subplot. It is, in the full context of what the two of them represent, one of the most theologically loaded relationships in the legendarium. Elves and dwarves have a history of distrust that goes back to the First Age. The Silmarillion documents it. There were moments of violence. There were long stretches of proud mutual avoidance. There was the matter of the Noglamir, the necklace of the dwarves, set with the Silmaril, an event that ended in bloodshed and set the template for centuries of mutual wariness. By the time of the Third Age, elves and dwarves were not enemies, but they were not friends. They kept their distances. They traded when it was necessary and were otherwise separate. Gimli and Legolas dismantled that. In the ruins of Moria, in the aftermath of Gandalf's fall, with the grief still raw, these two figures, who should by every cultural instinct have remained at arm's length from each other, chose proximity instead. And then they chose, across the journey that followed, something that neither culture had a word for. They chose to witness each other's worlds. Legolas would show Gimli the sea. Gimli would show Legolas the caverns of Aglarond. The glittering caves behind Helm's Deep would describe them with a beauty and reverence that stopped Legolas in his tracks. And at the end of the Third Age, when the time came for Legolas to sail west, he took Gimli with him, the first dwarf to pass into the Undying Lands, the first of his people to make that crossing. There is no official explanation in the canon for how this was permitted. The Undying Lands are not for dwarves. They are barely for men. The permission came, it is implied, from Manwë himself, the Elder King, or perhaps from Galadriel, who had petitioned on behalf of the elves who wished to sail. But however it happened, it happened. Gimli, son of Gloin, who had walked into Moria knowing, or half-knowing, he was walking into a tomb, who had stood over Balin's stone and said the words that had to be said, who had carried the grief of his people's greatest loss across the length of an age, was given passage to the Undying Lands. As a grace for what he had witnessed, as a recognition that he had done something his people's grief had prevented them from doing for 1,000 years, that he had gone in and faced it and come back and continued. Tolkien does not say, but the shape of it suggests something. The dwarves are the children of Arlo, made by a Vala who acted in impatience and love, who reached for creation before the time was right, and whose children carry that mark, that slight displacement from the intended order of things, their entire existence. They have no place in the Undying Lands. They are not woven into Mandos's halls the way elves are. Tolkien says, in various places, that the dwarves believe their dead go to a special hall with Auli himself, that they will be raised at the breaking of the world to help Auli remake it. But that is belief, not confirmed cosmology. And yet Gimli sails. Something about what he did, what he witnessed, what he carried and chose to continue carrying, earned him a passage that his people had no tradition of seeking and no framework for expecting. The stone child of Aule, the keeper of the grief that could not be spoken for 1,000 years, found his way to the shore and sailed west into a light that was not made for his kind. Because he went in when his people could not. Because he said the words his people had not been able to say. Because he was the witness. Now we have to return to the question, not in the same form, not with the same weight it carried at the beginning of this journey. You know more now than you did when the question was first asked, and that knowledge changes it. When Gimli stood before the gates of Moria and voted to enter, was it a decision made in hope, or had he already, in the long privacy of 25 years of unanswered silence, already made peace with what he was going to find? The question has deepened, because now it is not really a question about Gimli's knowledge or ignorance. It is a question about what it means to go anyway, to walk through a door you suspect is the entrance to a grave, because someone has to walk through it. Because the grief of a people cannot stay compressed forever, cannot stay hardened in the stone of their chests without doing damage, and somewhere, sometime, someone has to go in and say the words. The line between courage and self-deception is sometimes impossible to find. But Tolkien, who spent his entire adult life writing about a world shaped by loss, about the way beautiful things pass, about the way even the greatest works of the elder days crumble and are forgotten and become only shapes in the dark, Tolkien knew something about the necessity of witness. He had been a witness himself. He had watched his closest friends die in the mud of the Somme. He had carried their names for the rest of his life, woven them into the fabric of a mythology, because myth was the only container large enough to hold what he had seen and not break. He knew what it cost to go in. He knew what it meant to come back, and he gave that knowledge, that specific and devastating knowledge, not to Frodo or Aragorn or Gandalf, the figures the story seems to be most about. He gave it to Gimli, the dwarf who told jokes about axes, the warrior who was too short for the horse, the character the films turned into comic relief, and the casual viewer filed under lovable sidekick. He gave it to the son, who went into the dark, because his people had been unable to go for 25 years, for 1,000 years. Because the wound was old enough to have geology, old enough to have its own layers of sediment, its own compressed history of not quite grieving, and the wound needed a witness. Here is what all of it finally means. Tolkien did not write Gimli's ignorance into the story because he forgot the timeline or because the information gap was narratively convenient. He wrote it because the ignorance, real or chosen or somewhere in between, was the truest possible expression of what it means to be Durin's folk in the Third Age. A people who have lost so much, so many times, so completely, that they have developed not a healthy relationship with grief, but a kind of armored relationship with hope. A hope that is maintained not by evidence, but by the specific dwarf capacity to endure, to press forward, to keep the dream alive past the point where the dream has any rational basis, because the alternative is to sit down in the exile and simply not get up. Balin went into Moria because the dream demanded it. His people, watching from outside, allowed themselves not to know the outcome because the dream demanded that too. Gimli went in because 25 years of not knowing had finally become its own kind of unbearable, and the only thing left to do was to find out. And what he found was what he feared. And what he did with what he found was continue. That is the lore the films never told you. Not the timeline, not the silence, not the gap between the letters stopping and the fellowship entering. The deeper lore. The lore of what grief looks like in a people for whom it has no proper channel. The lore of what courage looks like when it is indistinguishable from a man who has already accepted the loss and walks toward it anyway. Not to be surprised by it, but to stand over it and name it. He is dead then. It is as I feared. And then he picked up his axe and kept going. So here, at the end of all of it, is the question in its final and fullest form. Not, did Gimli know? Not even, why did no one investigate? But this, what does it mean to love something enough to go in and confirm that it is gone? What does it mean to carry a grief that your people could not carry, to walk into the dark on their behalf, to be the one who finally says the word that turns the silence into loss, and the loss into something that can be held and known and, eventually, crossed? What does it mean to be the witness when everyone else has found reasons not to look? It means, I think, that the line between denial and devotion is not always visible from the outside. It means that hope, carried long enough in the specific way that dwarves carry things, in the stone way, the compressed internal way, the way that does not show on the surface, but that does not let go either, can become something that is not quite hope anymore, but has not yet become despair. It means that Gimli, son of Gloin, standing at those gates in the cold and the dark, was doing something more complex and more human than either the heroic reading or the tragic reading accounts for. He was doing the thing that his people's grief had prevented them from doing. He was going in. And the fact that he came back, that he made friends with an elf and fought at Helm's Deep, and stood at the Black Gate, and eventually sailed west into a light made for other kinds of beings, suggests that the witness survived. That the grief was carried and faced and named, and then set down in the way that grief can be set down once it has been fully acknowledged. That is what the 25 years of silence was actually about. Not information failure. Not political calculation. Not Doin's inaction, or Gandalf's withholding, or the convenient narrative gap that lets the audience be surprised by Balin's tomb alongside Gimli. It was about the specific, recognizable, deeply human impossibility of accepting a loss you are not ready to accept. And then the specific, recognizable, deeply necessary act of going in and accepting it anyway. Because the silence has finally become heavier than the truth. Gimli carried a wound that was 1,000 years old into a mountain that had been dark for 25 years and came out changed. Not broken, not destroyed. Changed in the way that only witnessing changes you. He came out knowing what he had known as fear, and now knew as fact. And with that fact in hand, something that had been compressed and armored and unresolvable in the stone way of dwarf grief began, slowly, to become something else. Not healing, exactly. Not in any simple sense, but the first step toward it, the naming. He is dead then. Yes, he is dead, and now you know. And now the 25 years of silence have a shape and a location and a grave marker. And now you can carry it with edges instead of carrying it as fog. And now you can keep going. If this is the first time you have really heard what Tolkien was doing with Gimli, I want to know. Because I think most people who love this world have felt the weight of that scene in the chamber of Mazarbul without having the full context to understand why it hits so hard. The scene works even without the timeline, even without the appendix, even without the psychological architecture of dwarf grief across the legendarium. But when you have all of that, when you bring the 25 years, and the stopped letters, and the unanswered silence, and Glóin's journey to Rivendell, and Gandalf's quiet withholding, and the line at the tomb, when you hold all of it together, what you find is not just a sad scene in a cave. You find one of the most quietly devastating meditations on grief and witness, and the courage of knowing that Tolkien ever wrote. Drop your reading in the comments. Did you see Gimli as the witness, or did the ignorance always feel real to you? Because that tension, between knowing and not knowing, between the courage to go in and the impossibility of facing what waits there, is at the heart of what makes this story matter. And there is more in the legendarium that touches that nerve. If you want to keep going deeper, subscribe and stay close. We have barely scratched the surface of what Tolkien encoded in the people nobody talks about enough. The dwarves are waiting, and the mountain has more to say.